The old university library stood silent as Detective James Morgan climbed the worn stone steps. It was 7:30 a.m., and the morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows. A rare book had been stolen, not just any book, but a first edition of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, worth over $100,000. The security cameras went dark at exactly midnight, explained Mrs. Reynolds, the head librarian. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her hands shook slightly as she unlocked the rare books room. When I arrived this morning, the display case was empty. Detective Morgan examined the glass case. There was no sign of forced entry. Who has access to this room? Only 4 people have the key code. Myself, my assistant, Thomas, the university dean, Dr. Williams, and the security guard, Mr. Peterson. The code hasn't been changed in 6 months. Morgan walked slowly around the room, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The room was perfectly organized, with climate-controlled cases lining the walls. Nothing seemed disturbed, except for the empty Dickens display. "Tell me about light," he said, pulling out his notebook. Mrs. Reynolds adjusted her glasses. "I left at 6 p.m. Thomas stayed late to catalog new acquisitions. Mr. Peterson was on duty until midnight, and Dr. Williams was hosting a fundraising dinner in the main hall until 10 p.m. As Morgan jotted down notes, he noticed something odd, a faint smell of coffee near the window. The library had a strict no food or drinks policy in the rare books room. "Does anyone drink coffee in here?" Mrs. Reynolds looked offended. "Absolutely not. It's strictly forbidden." Morgan moved to the window and found what he was looking for, a tiny brown stain on the windowsill. He took out his phone and called the station. "I need the security footage from the building across the street, facing the library's east side. Last night, midnight to 1 a.m. While waiting for the footage, Morgan interviewed the other key holders. Thomas, the young assistant, seemed nervous, but had a solid alibi. He was at a concert with friends, with social media posts to prove it. Dr. Williams was still angry about the theft, concerned about the university's reputation. Mr. Peterson, the night guard, reported nothing unusual during his rounds. The security footage arrived by email. Morgan watched it carefully on his laptop. At 12:15 a.m., a shadow moved across the library window. Someone had been in the room after the cameras went dark. Morgan returned to the rare books room and examined the window more closely. There was a nearly invisible scratch on the lock. Someone had picked it rather than breaking it. He gathered everyone in the library's main hall. "The theft was well planned," he began. The thief knew the security system, knew the room's layout, and knew exactly when to act. But they made 3 small mistakes. The suspects watched him nervously as he paced. First, they left traces of coffee, a drink strictly forbidden, in the rare books room. Second, they picked the window lock to create a false entry point, but the scratch pattern shows it was done from the inside, not the outside. And third, they assumed a building across the street wouldn't have cameras facing this direction. Morgan turned to face the group. Only one person had both the access and the opportunity. Only one person would know exactly when the security cameras would go dark because they controlled them. And only one person regularly drinks coffee during the night shift. All eyes turned to Mr. Peterson, the security guard. His face went pale. "The book is in your locker at the security office, isn't it, Mr. Peterson? You planned to sell it to a private collector, using your brother's antique bookshop as a front. You shut down the cameras, entered the rare books room with your access code, took the book, and then picked the window lock from the inside to mislead us. But you forgot about your coffee habit And you didn't know about the new security cameras installed last month on the building across the street. Peterson's shoulders slumped. Times are hard, he muttered. My wife's medical bills. I knew a buyer who wouldn't ask questions. I never thought about the other building's cameras. Within an hour, the first edition of Great Expectations was recovered from Peterson's locker, perfectly intact. As Morgan watched the security guard being led away by uniformed officers, Mrs. Reynolds touched his arm. How did you know to check for coffee stains? She asked. Morgan smiled. In my experience, Mrs. Reynolds, it's always the small details that solve the big mysteries. Even the best planned crimes leave traces. You just have to know where to look for the shadows they cast. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the long shadows in the library had shortened. Another mystery solved, another story ended. But for Detective Morgan, there would always be more shadows to investigate, more secrets to uncover in the quiet corners of the city.